Thank you very much. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it. Well, on the way in, somebody came up to me and said, after last night, I have no idea what you're going to say. And I said, neither do I. So I'll have some random comments, which means incoherent, and do my best here. First of all, I want to be careful not to jump the gun on analysis. It would be very easy to, say, well, this happened, and then we all get in the car and hear on the car radio that a couple of points flipped and none of it happened. So at this stage of the game, unless you'll give me another couple of days to prepare something, we'll do our best. The bottom line is, I think the election was a disappointment for Republicans. Republicans were not only hoping and expecting to win both the House and the Senate, they were hoping and expecting to have a big victory. And they had good reason to think that. When you look at the fundamentals of where the country is now, the country is 3-1 negative on where things are going. Over about 75% are saying we're on the wrong track, and only about 25% saying we're on the right track. And that's not good for the party in power. You've got 61% of the electorate that, yesterday was saying we think we're in a recession, when the current president is saying we're not in a recession. You've got issues like the economy and inflation and crime and the border and all these issues that cut against the current administration and the Democratic leadership in Congress. So it was natural for pundits and Republicans to think that in the end, in this election, there would be some Republican wins. Everybody called it a wave. I tried to use the term wins, like gale force winds, because I thought the Republicans would have some wind at their back, as opposed to it being, a Category 5 hurricane. But in the end, it's hard to find a whole lot of evidence for that today. One thing that I thought was kind of interesting about the election was, even though 3/4 of the people in the country aren't happy with where the country is going, very few incumbents were defeated. Very few. There's a couple that are like hanging right now, like in Georgia and some of the Senate races and one of the governor's races. But basically, there were few incumbents who lost. And that makes you wonder, is the election system working in the country? Can people use their vote to register what they believe? And or is things so solidly polarized that everybody's stuck? Now, looking at the returns as objectively as possible, it's probable that the Republicans will win the House. They'll probably win the House with something like 7 to 8 to 10 to 12 seat gain, as opposed to the 30 or 40 seat gain a lot of people were expecting and Republicans were hoping for. And it's still possible that the Republicans will win the Senate. And of course, if they do that, that was their objective in the election. Right now, it looks like you've got the Senate's about even, and if you make some assumptions about the races that haven't been called yet, like Georgia and Nevada and Arizona and Alaska, I think you will come away believing that once again Georgia will make the difference, that the Republicans could end up with 50 seats the Democrats could end up with 49 seats. And if the Democrats have 49 seats and they win Georgia, then they have control because they have the vice president's vote in the Senate, which is exactly what happened 2 years ago, although they had 2 Georgia Senate seats. And the only way the Democrats could have control of the Senate 2 years ago is if they won both of those Georgia Senate seats, and they did. And so it's possible that'll happen again. So if you're in the political consulting business, I would advise you to immediately go to Georgia. There's going to be billions and billions of dollars spent. They already spent, I think, about $350 million on the Senate race in Georgia, and it's possible they'll spend another $350 million over the next 4 weeks. So the money that's going to be spent, the amount of campaigning that the people in Georgia are going to have to go through again is pretty serious. In fact, I noticed that Senator Warnock, his last TV spot had him talking about, he said, let's get out and vote so this election doesn't go into overtime. He said, we don't need that for the state. And well, sure enough, it looks like it will. One thing to keep in mind about how votes come in now, and it's a little different than it used to. And Louisiana, by the way, is not following this pattern. But it's almost like something of a bell curve, where you start off with Republicans on the bottom because early votes are coming in. And early votes favor Democrats because Democrats vote early more often than Republicans, and there's some reasons for that. And then, over time, the Republicans start doing better, and then sort of late at night or in the middle of the night, then that's when they win their elections. But then, at the very end, they start going back down again as the mail votes come in from a lot of places that also tend to favor Democrats, particularly on the West Coast. So this whole idea of, well, we used to have elections and watching Bennett Johnston and Edwin Edwards and see how they go, but in the rest of the country now, it's not so continuous. And like there were some races that early on last night were showing Democrats winning by 70%, and today they're losing. So the method of voting is really having a big impact on how campaigns are run, how much money is spent, and all of it. Now, Louisiana is different. People in Louisiana vote early because they like to vote early. They feel like it's convenient and they want to do it. The political parties haven't really politicized voting methods in Louisiana to the extent that it has been in these other swing states. And because of that, like for instance, John Kennedy's vote in the Senate race started off at about sort of 62%, and 61, 62, 63%, went up to about 65, and I believe the final count now is about 62. So there wasn't a radical difference. And in some ways, when you look at the early votes, as long as it continues like this, it's almost like a poll, because it's almost like a random sampling of the whole electorate. So you can pretty much gauge where the votes are. And WWL-TV last night, we called all the congressional races within 15 minutes of the polls closing, because based on the early vote, we had a poll that was showing all these people winning by big margins, so there was no reason not to call it. Now, speaking of the polls, last time I was here, we talked about that at some length, and one of the things that we saw in the 2016 presidential race with Clinton and Trump and then the 2020 presidential race with Trump and Biden, and more specifically the Senate races in 2020, was that there was an anti-Republican bias in the polls. Now, even though the polls weren't as far off as people think they were in the 2016 race with Clinton, because the national polls were showing her winning the national vote, and she won the national vote. It was just the critical states. Some of them didn't do polling that much at the end, so you didn't see that they weren't able to measure the Trump's coming together, his vote coming together at the end, and that wasn't a problem with polls. It was a problem with the sponsor of polls that they didn't poll until the end of the race. But then in the 2020 elections, the polls showed that on average that Biden would win by an 8-point margin, and he won by basically a 4-point margin. And now, from where I come from, that's a big difference, because it's sort of the picture of the race that the polls are painting, not just the specific numbers. And the picture of the race in 2016 was that Clinton would win, and she didn't. And in 2020, Biden would win by a pretty significant margin. And even though he did win, I guess saying that I could never win a Republican nomination for anything now, but he did win because he ended up with about a 4-point lead, about a 7 million vote lead. But in the Senate races, almost every poll, and not every poll, but in almost every Senate race, the poll averages showed the Democrats doing much better than they did on Election Day. And interestingly enough, in the presidential election, it showed that Biden, the poll average had Biden at 51.5%, and he got 51.3%. So the polls were right on Biden's vote. But the polls also showed that that Trump was like getting about 43% when he got almost 47%. So the polls underestimated Trump's vote. It got the Democratic votes pretty much right, but it underestimated the Republican votes. And the reason for that was when you take a poll, it's easier to get college graduates to respond to a poll than non-college graduates. And college graduation as a variable now tends to favor Democrats. Trump's base, for instance, is non-college educated white voters. That's his base. And so if you're oversampling college educated voters, you're going to get too many Democrats in the sample. And that's basically what was happening. The other thing is modern polling, because of the techniques where you have to now call cell phones, not just landlines, and people are mixing different techniques together online and automated calling or whatever. Pollsters have to be very careful how they do this. The quality control of doing a poll is more difficult. And pollsters, the dirty little secret is that pollsters now have to make more assumptions than they used to have to make. And if you have a partisan bias in your head, it's very easy, even if you're trying to be accurate, and even if you're trying to be honest, it's very easy for that bias to come out in how it was done. And I think all of that was at play. Now, interestingly enough, what the Republicans did this year, and I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, some Democrats say it is, but it clearly happened, was Republican polling firms dumped a lot of polls into the mix this year, more so than usual. And there were fewer national polls from national media organizations like the New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, CNN, CBS, and the like. So what happened was a lot of the polls that were showing the Democrats doing better than they did a few years ago were not doing as many polls. and there were more Republican organizations doing polls that were being made public. So that was pumping up the Republican vote in the polls. So we can't tell yet because we don't have the exact numbers yet. But what's possible is you may have gone from the polls having been biased against Republicans on the poll averages to polls that were slightly biased in favor of Republicans in this particular election, which was part of the reason why a lot of Republicans thought they would do a lot better than they did. Now, let's get to what all this means. Joe Biden. Well, a lot of the pundits are saying, well, now he's definitely going to run because the Democrats did better than expected, even though they may still lose both houses of Congress. But they did better than perceptions. And so what Biden's been doing is been right, and he should run. And this will encourage him to run. I'm not so sure that's correct. I think it may, just the opposite may happen, that Biden will say, well, wait a minute, things weren't as bad as we thought they could have been, so maybe what I should do is declare victory and get out and announce I'm not going to run again. If I was him, I would do that. I think it would actually help the Democratic Party if you could take him out of the picture and have a new face nominate for the Democrats. Now, whether he does it or not, who knows? The big loser last night, by any stretch of the imagination, was Donald Trump, for a number of reasons. Number one, he supported relatively, well, let me phrase it this way. He supported unnecessarily weak Republican candidates in primaries. And a lot of those candidates that he supported in primaries, some of them won because they were in states and districts that favored the Republicans by a pretty good margin. So they did okay. But a lot of the critical races didn't. Like, for instance, the Arizona Senate race, the Georgia Senate race, and a number of other races. The candidates that Trump saddled the Republican Party with turned out to be weaker than if the Republican Party, probably on its own, without Trump's involvement, could have nominated whoever the Republican voters would have wanted without Trump's involvement there. So that hurt Republicans. And the other thing that hurt Republicans from Donald Trump is that he distracts from the smart message for Republicans. He continues to talk about the 2020 election and how it was stolen from him. And he required all of his endorsees to agree with that. I actually know of a couple of people who were going to run for Senate in other states, and said that the word they got is, if you don't agree, if you're not going to publicly say Donald Trump won the election and it was stolen from him, that he won't support you. And now that had nothing to do with inflation and the border and crime and the economy and Afghanistan or any of the issues. That was Donald Trump's issue. And so it distracted the Republicans from running a clean change message on these issues, where the Democrats were weak. And that was Donald Trump and Donald Trump's doing. And I've been talking to people nonstop this morning and last night, and I've been talking to a lot of very big Trump supporters last night and this morning, saying we've got to get rid of him. He's hurting the Republican Party too much. He's we wake up every day and we don't know what he's going to say. We don't know what he's going to do. And he's distracting from what we need to be doing. And there's so I think there's intensified feeling about that. And all you have to do is look in some of the races. In Pennsylvania, for example, John Fetterman won the election. If one of the other Republicans had been nominated, they probably would have easily won. And that was, Trump's candidate, Dr. Oz. The Ohio situation and Georgia were perfect examples. In Ohio, Trump's candidate, Vance, did win. He won the election. And Ohio's become a pretty Republican state now. But he won the election by, I think, about 6 points. But the Republican governor, Mike DeWine, who is independent of Trump and who has been attacked by Trump, won his election by about 25 points, you see. So the Republicans who are being attacked by Trump when they get into general elections are far outpolling Trump. Same thing happened in Georgia. The Senate race is virtually even right now. But Governor Brian Kemp, who's the Republican incumbent governor, was strongly opposed for renomination by Trump in the primaries. And Kemp beat the Trump candidate by a big margin. And he went and won the governor's race yesterday by, I think, about 7 or 8 points. So point being that the Republican candidates who aren't tied to Trump are doing very, very well, you see. And the ones who aren't are fighting very close battles. And that brings us to, and the other thing, too, is you say, well, why are Trump's candidates weak? Well, one of the reasons is that they're inexperienced candidates. You put somebody like Dr. Oz or Blake Masters into a race that never run for office before. This is a $300 and some million campaign. It's got the whole country looking, and you don't have experience as a candidate. And so throwing in the big races, inexperienced people who haven't run before is difficult. It's just very difficult for them to put things together. Now, the big winner last night was Ron DeSantis. He was expected to win. Most people thought he'd win by maybe 8 to 10 points. He won by almost 20 points, about 19 points. That's a big margin, particularly in a state like Florida that just 20 years ago was the quintessential 50-50 swing state. And not only did he win, but he won Miami-Dade, which was the Democratic base in Florida, and he won it. And he won Palm Beach County, which was hardcore Democratic, and he won that. So this was a big win for DeSantis, and if he does in fact run for president. And so if DeSantis had a big win, Trump had a lot of problems. So it seems to me that will help suck DeSantis into the Republican presidential race. And you talk about a race, that will be something fascinating to watch. Already, well, of course, Trump was calling him de-sanctimonious the other day. And then, I think yesterday, Trump made a comment something like, DeSantis better be careful because I know more about him than anybody, including his wife. All right, so those are the kind of things that we're going to be served up. Money, as we talked about, was a big, big factor. I actually think, I've been in campaigns and for many years. I've been a consultant, so I've made money off of campaigns. But I actually think too much money is being spent in a lot of these campaigns. I just think that they're just pouring money into the campaigns. It's not always being spent well, and it's just a waste. And you might ask, well, what can we do to stop that? Well, there's one solution to it, and that as contributors, just say no. Don't give them the money anymore. Stop giving them so much money. A lot of these super PACs are run, they can't collude with the candidates. So their messages sometimes are off, and they do things that are sometimes off. And it's, the campaign finance system is really broken, but it's broken because the regulations are making it worse. And a free system where you didn't have contribution limits would probably work better now as long as everything was disclosed, because you wouldn't have to channel money through outside organizations. You could just give it directly to the candidates, and then the candidates would be responsible for taking the money and spending it. They would be publicly responsible for that. Now they can say, oh, I didn't have anything to do with that, somebody else did. Any other presidential candidates that might have emerged last night? There were two people on the ballot, two Democrats, two governors, that I think you're going to see a lot more of. One is the governor of California, Gavin Newsom. Is very liberal, as you would expect the Democratic governor of California to be. But he has won big elections with big victory margins. One of the tests of presidential candidates is how long does it take you to raise the first 100 million? And he can raise the first 100 million like that, just like DeSantis can raise the first 100 million like that. DeSantis raised 200 million in his re-election campaign for governor. So you know what he could raise in a presidential race. But I think Gavin Newsom is somebody to watch for the Democrats, particularly if Biden doesn't run. And the other person is Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. She was reelected. She took a lot of flack on her handling of the pandemic. People thought she was too rigid and strict in what she was doing. But I think she suits where the Democratic Party is pretty well. And I have to say, I saw both her and her opponent debate, and actually, I thought both did well. But she has the potential to be a national candidate. So those would be some of the people to watch. Now, here in Louisiana, there was only one big statewide race, and that was the Senate race. John Kennedy won it easily. He got, the last number I saw was 62%, which was an impressive win. 6 years ago, when he beat Foster Campbell, he got about a little over 60%. So he did even better than he did in a two-person runoff 6 years ago. So that was a big win for him. And I think the impact on the coming governor's race is important. I think the numbers that we saw yesterday should pretty clearly tell Democrats they're going to have a tough time, if not an impossible time, electing the governor. It's just a fact. And so Democrats can either put their money and time and effort into trying to elect somebody who probably won't win, as opposed to maybe picking a Republican who they would prefer, who probably could win. And there's a big vacuum in the governor's race now. We had talked about that the last time. It's possible Senator Cassidy could have filled the vacuum and still could. It's possible your congressman here, Garrett Graves, could fill the vacuum and get in the governor's race. It's also possible that Kennedy would run for governor. A lot of people say, well, why would you run for governor when you're already a U.S. senator? Well, here in Louisiana politics, particularly if you've lived in Baton Rouge and worked around the state capitol, the governor of Louisiana is sort of the king of the mountain, and more so than in other states. And politicians who have worked around the capitol, they all kind of want to be governor at some point. And I know Kennedy thought seriously about running for governor several times. And this would probably be his best shot if he ran this time. Now, I'm not saying he should or shouldn't run. That's his business. But just in terms of handicapping, I think it's something to watch because there is a vacuum in the governor's race right now. There is a place, I think, for another Republican to get in. And we'll see if that other Republican is Kennedy or maybe Cassidy or Garrett Graves or somebody else, for that matter. And I suspect we'll be hearing a lot of about that in the next month or two. I haven't slept much, but I'm happy to answer questions, as long as they're not difficult. So,
maybe time for one question.
Sure.
Will Steve Scalise be the next Speaker of the House?
Pardon?
Will Steve Scalise be the next Speaker of the House?
No, Kevin McCarthy is likely to be the next Speaker of the House. It looks like the Republicans will win the House, not by a lot, but will win it, and he would be the candidate. Kevin McCarthy raised over $500 million for Republican House candidates in this election. $500 million he raised. So you tell me whether he's going to be the Speaker. Now, Scalise has a real shot at being the Speaker after McCarthy. So.